Imagine waking to frost on the inside of your bedroom window, your breath visible in the air as you steel yourself to leave the warmth of a heavy pile of quilts. Picture getting dressed under the covers or rushing to huddle around the single heat source in your entire home. For generations, this was not a camping trip. It was simply winter. Before the click of a thermostat became our answer to the cold, people relied on ingenious strategies, careful preparation, and genuine toughness to survive the frigid months. Here are 10 ways people stayed warm in the cold before central heating. Long before forced air furnaces, the fireplace was the literal and metaphorical heart of every home. In colonial and 19th century houses, the massive central chimney with its large cooking fireplace provided the only source of heat for the entire dwelling. Families oriented their lives around this fire, which burned continuously throughout the winter months. By the mid-1800s, cast-iron wood stoves began to replace open fireplaces in many homes, offering a revolutionary improvement. These stoves were far more efficient, radiating heat in all directions and requiring less wood. A well-tended wood stove could keep a room genuinely warm, rather than just taking the edge off the cold. The evening ritual of banking the fire, carefully arranging coals and ashes to keep embers alive overnight, was a crucial skill. If the fire went out completely, you would wake to a freezing house and face the laborious task of starting from scratch with kindling and flint. Before central heating, clothing was not just about fashion. It was essential survival equipment. People wore significantly more layers than we do today and relied on heavy wool, long underwear, and layered garments to trap heat. People treated their garments as personal insulation systems. Wool was king. Its natural ability to retain warmth even when damp made it irreplaceable. Women wore multiple petticoats under long skirts, along with wool stockings and often wool bloomers. Men bundled up in wool union suits, full-body undergarments that became standard by the late 1800s. These long johns were typically not removed from November through March. Children wore knitted wool everything: sweaters, scarves, mittens, and hats, often handmade by mothers and grandmothers during the previous winter. Nightcaps were not quaint accessories, but practical necessities for sleeping in unheated bedrooms. The idea of walking around your house in a t-shirt and bare feet during January would have seemed absolutely insane. In the era before electric blankets, people had to get creative about warming their beds. A bed warmer was one of the most common methods, a long-handled, covered pan filled with hot coals from the fire. Just before bed, someone, often a servant or an older child, would run this device between the sheets. People often warmed the bed in preparation for sleep. A more accessible alternative was the heated brick or stone, wrapped in flannel and placed at the foot of the bed. These bed bricks were warmed by the fire or stove and could retain heat for hours. Many families kept special bricks just for this purpose, heating them each evening as part of the bedtime routine. Similarly, hot water bottles and heated soapstones wrapped in cloth served as personal heaters that people could carry from room to room, clutch during carriage rides, or tuck into their laps while doing needlework. These simple heat reservoirs made the difference between miserable and tolerable on the coldest nights. Sleeping arrangements before central heating would shock most modern people. Bedrooms were typically unheated, and temperatures could drop below freezing. The solution was the bed itself, transformed into a fortress of warmth. The foundation was often a feather tick, a large fabric case stuffed with goose or duck down that served as a mattress, providing insulation from below. On top of this, sleepers piled multiple layers of heavy quilts, often handmade from scraps and filled with wool or cotton batting. A proper winter bed might have 5, 6, or even more quilts stacked on top. Down comforters, when families could afford them, were prized possessions passed down through generations. The weight alone of all these covers helped trap body heat. People would essentially burrow into these massive piles, sometimes sleeping in knitted caps and socks, creating a warm microclimate under the covers even as the room remained frigid. Heating an entire house was simply impractical and impossibly expensive in terms of firewood, so families adapted by essentially making their homes smaller in winter. As autumn turned to winter, entire sections of the house would be shut down. Upstairs bedrooms, parlors, guest rooms, and any space not absolutely necessary for daily life were closed off with doors shut tight. Furniture was often covered with sheets, and these rooms were abandoned until spring. The family would consolidate their living into just a few rooms closest to the heat source, typically the kitchen, a main sitting room, and sometimes 1 or 2 bedrooms. In farmhouses, it was common for entire families to move their sleeping arrangements downstairs for the winter, setting up beds in the parlor or even the kitchen to stay near the stove. This strategic retreat transformed winter life into a more intimate, crowded experience. Personal space was often sacrificed for survival. Before modern insulation and weather-tight construction, homes were notoriously drafty. Windows were single-pane, doors often ill-fitting, and walls provided minimal protection against winter winds. People fought back with layers of textile defenses. Heavy, floor-length velvet or wool curtains were hung across every window, serving as crucial insulation that trapped a layer of still air between the fabric and the glass. These were not decorative, they were essential. Many families also hung curtains or blankets across doorways, even interior ones, to prevent heat from escaping rooms. Thick rugs covered floors not just for comfort, but to insulate against cold rising from below, especially in homes with crawl spaces or cellars. Draft stoppers were long, stuffed fabric tubes placed along the bottoms of exterior doors. Windows might be sealed with putty or stuffed with rags, and in extreme climates, some people actually tacked blankets or oiled paper over windows for the entire winter, living in relative darkness to preserve warmth. Every crack and gap was an enemy to be defeated. Privacy in winter was a luxury few could afford. To conserve warmth, families slept together in ways that would seem unusual today. It was common for all the children in a family to share a single bed, sometimes sleeping crosswise with multiple kids at each end. Parents might share their bed with the youngest children. In particularly cold regions, entire families sometimes slept in the same room, if not the same bed. This wasn't just about saving firewood. Body heat was a valuable resource. The phrase 3-dog night, referring to a night so cold you needed 3 dogs in bed to keep warm, originates from this era of communal sleeping arrangements. Boarders and guests were expected to share beds with strangers at inns and taverns. This practical necessity created an intimacy in daily life that is hard for us to imagine now, but it was simply how people survived. The arrival of central heating in the 20th century did more than warm homes. It fundamentally changed family dynamics and social norms around personal space. Unlike summer, when heat-generating chores were dreaded and done at dawn, winter housework was strategically timed to maximize warmth. Baking day, when a week's worth of bread, pies, and other goods were prepared, was welcomed in January but avoided in July. The kitchen stove, burning hot for hours, would transform that room into the warmest space in the house. Families naturally gravitated there, and it became the de facto living room in winter. Laundry day, which involved boiling enormous pots of water and laboring over steaming washtubs, was exhausting work but provided significant heat. Ironing, done with heavy cast iron sad irons heated on the stove, kept both the iron wielder and the room warm. Even candle making and other crafts that required heat became winter activities. This wasn't just efficient. It was survival. The heat created by daily work wasn't an inconvenient byproduct. It was a crucial contribution to the household's warmth. Winter meals were naturally heavier and hot. Soups, stews, roasts, and baked goods. Not just because they were comforting, but because the cooking process itself was an important source of heat. Just as summer drove people to air-conditioned theaters and department stores, winter cold made certain public spaces precious refuges. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, public buildings, churches, schools, and libraries often had more substantial heating systems than private homes, large coal furnaces or steam radiators. For those living in tenement housing or poorly heated homes, the public library became not just a place for reading, but a warm haven. Schools, despite their reputation for being cold and drafty in rural areas, were still often warmer than home. Churches, heated for Sunday services, drew crowds as much for warmth as worship. In cities, the arrival of the department store with its coal-fired heating system made winter shopping a popular leisure activity, especially for women and children who could browse for hours in relative comfort. Taverns and saloons served the same purpose for men, offering not just drink, but warmth and social connection. The community understood that these warm public spaces served a vital social function, and it was accepted that communities often became refuges from the cold. People might linger longer than strictly necessary. Ice harvesting on frozen ponds, rivers, and lakes was serious business from the 1800s through the early 1900s, providing ice for ice boxes all year round. Cutting, hauling, and storing massive blocks of ice was grueling and cold, but it brought people together in a shared winter task. The physical labor helped keep workers warm, and afterwards, gathering around fires with hot cider or soup became a cherished ritual. Winter also brought play and social life. Ice skating parties on frozen ponds, sledding hills, and sleigh rides were not just entertainment. They were ways to embrace the season rather than merely endure it. Coming inside after hours in the cold made the warmth of even a modest fire feel like absolute luxury. Indoor winter parties with games, dancing, and crowded rooms generated their own heat. Quilting bees, barn dances, and long evening gatherings around the fire were survival strategies that turned isolation into community. They made the long, cold months bearable through shared warmth, both literal and metaphorical. While winter was harsh, communities found ways to turn the cold into opportunities for both work and social connection. Ice harvesting on frozen ponds, rivers, and lakes was serious business from the 1800s through the early 1900s, providing ice for ice boxes year-round. The work of cutting, hauling, and storing massive blocks of ice was grueling and cold, but it brought communities together in a shared winter task. The physical labor itself helped keep workers warm, and afterwards, gathering around fires with hot cider or soup was a cherished ritual. Community. Winter also brought its own forms of play and socializing. Ice skating parties on frozen ponds, sledding hills, and sleigh rides were not just entertainment, they were ways to embrace the season rather than merely endure it. Coming inside after hours in the cold made the warmth of even a modest fire feel like absolute luxury. Indoor winter parties, with their games, dancing, and crowded rooms of people, generated their own heat. Quilting bees, barn dances, and long evening gatherings around the fire were not just social. They were survival strategies that turned isolation into community, making the long, cold months bearable through shared warmth, both literal and metaphorical.